By the time the knock echoed through his lonely ranch house, Jed Carver had already decided he owed the world nothing. Not after what it took from him. But when he opened the door and saw an old Apache woman standing in the freezing wind, her 2 daughters shivering behind her, everything inside him shifted. Their eyes held desperation, fear, and something else he hadn't seen in years, trust. "No one gives us shelter," the old woman whispered. What Jed did next shocked even him. The night had rolled in bitter and cruel, carrying with it a wind sharp enough to slice through even the thickest coat. Jed Carver sat hunched at his kitchen table, the lamplight casting long shadows across the wooden floor. The supper he'd cooked lay untouched, beans he'd reheated twice and a chunk of cornbread hard enough to hammer nails. He poked at it with his fork, then pushed the plate away. Eating felt pointless when the silence was louder than hunger. He'd gotten used to that silence, learned to live with it like a scar, something always there but no longer bleeding. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only living sound in the cabin. Jed reached for his coffee, grimaced at the bitterness, and stood to throw another log onto the fire. And that's when it came, 3 weak knocks, spaced far apart, each one sounding like the end of someone's strength. Jed froze, hand hovering over the woodpile. No one came out his way. The town had long stopped trying to bring him back, and the few neighbors he had didn't ride in the dark unless something was dead or dying. For a moment, he wondered if he imagined it, but then the knock came again, softer, almost a plea swallowed by the wind. Jed moved to the door with the suspicion of a man who had learned life's worst lessons the hard way. He opened it just far enough to peer out, and the sight on his porch stopped his breath. An elderly Apache woman stood hunched beneath a tattered blanket, rain sliding off her silver hair, her face etched with exhaustion and pain. Flanking her were 2 girls, one perhaps 20, the other younger, maybe 16, both soaked, shivering, their thin dresses clinging to their small frames. Their feet were bare, cut, and muddy from miles of walking. The youngest clutched her mother's arm as if she were the last solid thing left in the world. Jed's first instinct was to shield himself, to retreat back into the hollow comfort of the life he'd built alone. But then the old woman lifted her eyes, meeting his with a combination of pride and desperation so raw it struck something deep inside him. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "Just one night. No one gives us shelter." Her words carried years of pain, not just the cold's bite. Jed's jaw clenched. He wasn't a man who invited strangers in. He wasn't a man who invited anyone in anymore. But the storm behind them was merciless, and the older girl's lips had turned a dangerous shade of blue. "Where's your camp?" he asked. The old woman shook her head slowly. "Gone. Soldiers burned it. We walked far. Too far." Jed had seen enough burned camps in his lifetime to know the truth wasn't softened by her few words. The younger girl swayed slightly, dizzy from cold, and instinct overcame grief before Jed had time to think about consequences. He opened the door wide. "Get in," he said gruffly. "Before the night finishes what the soldiers started." The old woman bowed her head in gratitude that was quiet, dignified, an acknowledgement, not servitude. The daughters hurried inside, their breath shaking as warmth began to reach them. Jed shut the door against the storm, realizing as he faced the 3 strangers standing in his once lifeless home that something had shifted. His cabin, thick with years of silence and ghosts, suddenly felt different, less like a tomb, and more like a place where life had returned without asking permission. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, Jed couldn't tell whether that frightened him, or made him feel alive. Jed wasn't used to movement in his house. He wasn't used to voices either, especially soft ones that carried gratitude and fear in equal measure. The 3 Apache women stood near the fire, their blankets steaming as the heat slowly pushed the cold out of their bones. Jed fetched a stack of towels, placing them on the table with a grunt that was more awkwardness than annoyance. The younger girl, Suri, he would later learn, reached for one with a shy, trembling hand. She murmured a thank you without raising her eyes. Her voice was so small, it tugged at something Jed didn't know was still alive in him. The older daughter stayed close to her mother, her stance guarded but strong. Jed noticed the way she positioned herself slightly ahead of the others, protective, alert, ready to act if he so much as lifted a finger wrong. She had the eyes of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast. Jed respected that kind of strength. He saw it in the mirror every morning. "I'll get you food," he muttered, turning before they could answer. He needed distance. Their presence stirred up things inside him he'd long locked away: kindness, purpose, the weight of responsibility he'd sworn he would never carry again after losing Sarah. He ladled hot beans and salted pork into bowls, setting them on the table. The old woman approached first, her steps slow but graceful. She placed a hand on the back of the chair but did not sit until Jed nodded. The daughters followed, sitting side by side, sharing one blanket between them. They ate with controlled hunger, not desperate, not greedy, but with the solemn gratitude of people who'd been denied such comfort too often. "Your name?" the old woman asked gently, breaking the silence. "Jed Carver," he replied, leaning against the counter instead of joining them at the table. "Been living here near on 6 years." The old woman nodded thoughtfully. "A man alone that long must have a heavy story." Jed felt the words like a flare pressed to an old wound. "I don't tell it." "I didn't ask you to," she said simply. "Only meant that loneliness follows a person with reason." Her tone held no judgment, just quiet truth. It disarmed him more than any accusation could have. The older daughter finally spoke, her voice steady. "We can work for the shelter. Chop wood. Cook. Clean. We will not be a burden." Jed's brows lifted slightly. "Didn't say you were. Just gave you a place to warm up." "But warmth," the girl replied, looking him straight in the eyes, "is something people charge us for." Jed's jaw tightened at that. The West was cruel. He knew it. He'd seen good men turned into monsters, and monsters turned into lawmen. Apache women, especially unprotected ones, were often treated worse than strays. The thought made something dark twist in his gut. "You're safe here," he said quietly. Suri's shoulders loosened at those words, as if she'd been holding her breath since she stepped through his door. The old woman, too, seemed to ease a fraction, studying Jed with a gaze that felt impossibly deep. "You have a kind spirit, Jed Carver," she said. "One wounded does not lose its shape. It only hides." Jed didn't reply. He didn't know how. Instead he grabbed his coat from the peg. "I'll check the livestock. Storm spooked earlier." But as he reached for the door, he heard something that made him pause. "Jed," Suri said softly. "Will we be allowed to stay until morning?" He turned. Her young face, still pale with cold, held fear she tried hard to hide. It struck him like a blow that she even felt the need to ask. He stepped out of the shadows of his own pain and met her gaze fully. "You'll stay," he said. "All of you. No matter what comes." And as the storm outside softened to a whisper, Jed realized that he had just made a promise he hadn't expected to give. And one he wasn't sure he could afford to break.